Okay, to start off our reading list for 2025, we're going to start with the book that was my favourite one all year. And I'm not joking or exaggerating in any way. This was the book that truly made me fall back in love with reading. It's a classic, Dr. Zhivago by Boris Pasternak. It's an absolutely wonderful book, and you may say, well, surely you're exaggerating, this book, you say that it made you fall back in love with reading. You sound like a pretentious git. Well, that may be the case. I'm certainly not disputing that. It is an absolutely wonderful read, and I'm going to explain why. The first thing I really loved about it is that in the pages, Pasternak kind of gives and alludes to certain truths, within the pages. I really, really like that. I'll give you a nice quote. It's from, early on in the book. This world of baseness and falsity, where a well-fed little lady dares to look like that at a witless working people, and the drunken victim of this order finds pleasure in jeering at one of his own kind. The world was now more hateful to him than ever. It's a lovely quote. I really, really like that. It kind of alludes to the fact, that in life it's often the hard-working people that are looked down upon. Well, those who do nothing of any sort of value or anything, insert any celebrity, any talentless celebrity that is today, kind of gets looked down upon. Also, I love the part where he said, the drunken victim of this order finds pleasure in jeering one of his own kind. If any of you have ever read Oliver Twist, it's kind of a very similar dynamic to Noah Claypole. Even those of us who are downtrodden and down on our luck in life, it's a very cruel human instinct, to kind of punch down on somebody else. It's pretty horrible, but that's just unfortunately the way the cookie crumbles, I suppose, in society. Anyway, moving on from that to a more positive note, the other thing I really loved about this was the vivid and poetic descriptions of the landscape. Boris Pasternak, of course, was a poet, and I've read some of his works recently, and he's a very nice poet. I like him. He's quite expressive, and it really, really comes across in this book. I'll read you an early passage from a chapter from the first chapter, actually, of the book, just to kind of get the point across. Past them in clouds of hot dust, bleached as with the lime by the sun, flew Russia. Fields and steppes, towns and villages, wagon trains stretched across the roads, turning off cumbersomely through the crossings. And from the furiously speeding train it seemed that the wagons were standing still, and the horses were raising and lowering their legs in place. At big stations the passengers rushed like mad to the buffet, and the setting sun behind the trees of the station garden shone on their legs and the wheels of the carriages. Separately, all the movements of the world were calculatingly sober, but as a sum total they were unconsciously drunk with the general current of life that united them. People toiled and bustled, set in motion by the mechanism of their own cares. But the mechanisms would not have worked if their chief regulator had not had been a sense of supreme and fundamental carefreelessness. Oh, I can barely speak. It's funny, I should get elocution lessons from Professor Henry Higgins. That's a quote of to the musical My Fair Lady. Anyway, the carefreelessness came from the sense of the cohesion of human existences, a confidence in their passing from one into another, a sense of happiness owing to the fact that everything that happens takes place not only on earth, in which the dead are buried, but somewhere else, in what some call the kingdom of God, others history, and still others something else. What a truly, truly beautiful passage. It's poetic and in a way has a sort of a melody to itself, and it's certainly explained by the fact that Pasternak was a poet, and a pretty darn good one if I say so myself. Moving on, another thing I really loved about this book is the portrayal of two emotions, love and resentment. Of course, the book is a love story, and I won't say anything more as so as not to spoil it. But Pasternak, he really captures the emotion and the feeling of resentment incredibly well. Um, certainly, certainly, he does it better than any other author that I've ever encountered, and it's kind of illustrated by kind of the I suppose a certain villain in the plot called Strelnikov. I won't spoil anything, but I'll just read you a passage and see what Pasternak means. This is in regards to Strelnikov. Two features, two passions distinguished him. He taught with outstanding clarity and correctness, and he possessed a rare degree of moral purity and fairness, was a man of warm and noble feelings. But for the activity of a scientist laying out new paths, his mind lacked the gift of unexpectedness, that power which unforeseen discoveries disrupts the fruitless harmony of empty foresight. And for doing good, he, a man of principle, lacked the unprincipledness of the heart, which knows no general cases but only particular ones, and which is great in doing small things. From an early age, Strelnikov had striven for the highest and brightest. He considered life an enormous arena in which people, honourably observing the rules, compete in the attainment of perfection. When it turned out that this was not so, it never entered his head that he was wrong in simplifying the world order. Having driven the offence inside for a long time, he began to cherish the thought of one day becoming an arbiter between life and the dark principles that distort it, of stepping forth to its defence and avenging it. Disappointment embittered him. The revolution armed him. What a wonderful passage. I know I'm extolling the virtues of this book a lot, but it's it so perfectly captures, the feeling that you have, of being hard done by. But I like it that the fact that Pasternak doesn't romanticize resentment. As a matter of fact, he does the opposite. He shows the destructive effects of it, and that's all I'm going to say without spoiling the book. I really, really recommend that you read this. Okay, so the second book that I really would recommend that you read going into the new year is a somewhat interesting one, actually. It's I would say, at least from my own personal interests, my favourite, and it's Empire of the Clouds by James Hamilton Patterson, a very good author, and quite a nice name as well. I would actually, even though it's an aviation book and it primarily focuses on the rise and fall of British aviation in the 1950s, I would recommend that people who aren't particularly fans of aviation read this as well. That may seem illogical. I mean, why are you saying that? If you don't like aircraft, then why read this book? Well, for one, I really love the fact that it has such beautiful prose, as with Dr. Zhivago. There's a wonderful quote from Barry Goldwater, the American senator. He ran against Lyndon Baines Johnson in the 1965 U.S. presidential election, excuse me. But he said the following: any pilot can describe the mechanics of flying. What it can do to the spirit of man is beyond description. And this book, James Hamilton Patterson, he really captures that feeling. He captures like the joy and the beauty, and indeed the effervescence of flight. There's also a pretty nice quote here. It made me smile, about how much kind of safety culture has changed since the 1950s, and I'll read it out for you. It's from the first part of the book. For example, it is revealing to look at some of the air-to-air photographs of prototype aircraft being tested in the late 40s and 50s. Inside the cockpits, their grinning faces turned towards the camera only yards away, are men, often in their shirt sleeves or wearing a jacket and tie, quite frequently bareheaded. Nothing better illustrates the gulf between the world they inhabited then and our own world today than the way they dress to fly. It is not just the informality that strikes us, but the lack of kit. From the present day, ruled as we are by the endless repeated mantra of for your own safety and security, we look at men carrying out a morning's worth of potentially lethal spinning trials, wearing the jacket from their demob suits, and with nothing on their heads but a dab of Brill cream. In some of the pictures, they seem not even to be wearing a parachute. The point is not that people today make too much of a fetish about kit. rather that the change in attitude towards safety has had certain consequences. Nor it is to say that modern Britain has become too tame, exactly, especially for boys, although a growing interest in extreme sports is a good argument for that hypothesis, but that increasingly apprehensive and risk-averse in matters of personal security percolates through everything else. The buoyant lift of adventure is too easily cancelled by the drag of a health and safety executive regulations, insurance compensation claims, disability pensions, and, well, societal disapproval. Are today's Britons too collective and cowed for rugged individualism, let alone for civil disobedience? Too bored or lazy to acquire manual skills? These are imponderables. I just really love that quote. It so perfectly captures it just captures, as he puts it, like, the drag of health and safety. It's not to say that health and safety doesn't have a place, but beyond a certain point, it becomes way too excessive, as he was mentioning. I like the fact as well that in this book, James Hamilton Patterson, he doesn't romanticize the past. Too often, I find, and I do it myself, that we tend to romanticize the past a lot and extol its virtues and everything like that. While the past was good in certain aspects, it was also negative in others. For instance, in this, Hamilton Patterson, even though he praises the ingenuity and the sheer daring do of, like, the designers and the pilots who were creating such amazing planes like the Avro Vulcan, which you see on the cover, the Hawker Hunter, the Supermarine Scimitar, and so on. He also mentions the fact that that this way of managing projects, it was kind of the undoing of the British aviation industry, and also he hints at the fact that that there was still rationing going on until the early 1950s, I believe. So I like that he doesn't romanticize the past. He gives a fairly objective look at it, but he laments the passing of such a very talented and innovative workforce, in terms of, like, the engineers, the technicians, and the pilots that made it all happen, which is pretty sad. I really liked as well in it. This is my own personal interpretation, but there's a great lesson in this on overconfidence and hubris, and why, if you're not careful, like a lead that you could establish early on in, say, business, could be very quickly eroded. A good example would be Gloucester, the British aviation company. It's mentioned quite a lot in this book, actually. But towards the end of World War II, they developed this jet aircraft called the Meteor. It was actually one of the first in service. The other was the Messerschmitt Me-262, the famous Schwalbe or Swallow. In 1945, Britain actually had this in frontline service, albeit in small enough numbers, but it was still in Royal Air Force service. By comparison, France, the aviation industry in France was in a dire state. Of course, France was occupied in June of 1940 by the Germans. In the northern part, anyway, the south became Vichy France. Their aviation industry was put to work, license producing components for German aircraft like the Bf-108, the very beautiful liaison aircraft that's actually kind of I think of it as the father of the Messerschmitt 109, the famous German fighter from the war. I mean, then of course, the French were then pretty heavily bombed by the United States Army Air Force, the 8th Air Force, and of course Royal Air Force Bomber Commands. Then when the Germans, their forces pulled back, following D-Day in June of 1944, they sabotaged a lot of the French aviation industry to prevent it from falling into the hands of the Allies. So going from that, the French, it looks like they were in a terrible state, that they would have no hope of ever regaining Britain's lead, and even in contemporary aviation technology like the Spitfire, never mind more advanced stuff like jet propulsion. But as a matter of fact, they did in a decade. It's fairly interesting. I believe that their first proper jet fighter, excuse me, I should say, the Dassault Oregon. I don't know if I'm pronouncing the last part correctly. It was quite literally designed in a shed by Marcel Dassault and a few engineers in an actual garden shed, which is pretty comical post World War II. But fast forward 10 years to 1955, the Oregon was selling extremely well. Dassault were in the very early stages of developing their Mirage jet fighter. Yet if you look at the British side with Gloucester, Gloucester weren't doing so hot. They were introducing a new aircraft called the Gloucester Javelin. Um, I think it's an oddly beautiful aircraft. It's a big angular-looking twin-engine Delta with a T-tail. Very impressive looking, but it was having a lot of problems, a lot of very severe problems with the prototypes. I won't mention any more, but they go into this in quite a bit of detail. Actually, it's fairly fascinating. Um, and the British government they were slowly reducing their order of Gloucester Meteors because 10 years later the Gloucester Meteor, it looked, well, quite frankly, it looked very obsolete compared to the MiG-15 and the MiG-17 from the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact in general, and even compared to the Americans with the F-86 Sabre. It looked a bit long in the tooth, shall we say. Anyway, complex metaphor aside, it's a very, very good way of showing, constantly keep on developing, keep on improving, and don't take a lead that you have for granted. So that's it. That's James Hamilton Patterson's Empire of the Clouds. I highly recommend that you read this book. It was a fantastic read. I read it in about a week. A fantastic page turner. Okay, the final book that I would really recommend that you read going into 2025 would be Arnhem by Anthony Beevor. Anthony Beevor, of course, is a very famous historian from the UK. He's a very good author as well, very well researched. This book describes and there's only one way I can describe this, the absolutely unmitigated disaster that was Operation Market Garden. This year, as a matter of fact, was the 80th anniversary of Operation Market Garden, which basically involved two parts. The British and the American airborne divisions dropping to capture, a series of road bridges going into Holland or the Netherlands, and because of that, the Allies and mainly the British would be able to swing into the northern part of Germany and essentially cut off the Ruhr Valley. Ruhr Valley. I don't know. I certainly haven't pronounced that correctly. I'm not a fluent German speaker either. That's for sure. um, this book, I really enjoyed it. Apart from the fact that it brings such a historical and important series of battles and campaigns to life. It's good because you can see how bad decision making gradually and slowly compounds on top of each other until you get something, an absolute calamity like this. For instance, to start off with, General Browning and General Montgomery, the two British generals who planned the operation, they completely discounted the intelligence reports from the Dutch resistance that there were two SS Panzer divisions in the Arnhem area. They also made a very silly assumption in assuming that the Germans, by this stage of the war, were completely, demotivated and demoralized, and that they'd virtually just surrender without a fight. That was not the case at all. You can also see how this overconfidence it translated into General Gavin, who was an American general involved in the battle, who dropped around Nijmegen, that area, to capture the bridge, being ordered to secure the Groesbeck Heights, kind of bordering a series of woodlands, as opposed to capturing his main objective, which was the Nijmegen Bridge, which allowed, the Germans to, rush in reinforcements and make it a much tougher battle, make it much tougher for them to dislodge. And of course, the airborne forces lost a very, very vital amount of time doing that. That allowed the disaster to unfold as it did. I like the fact that it also doesn't glamorize the battle. I mean, too often in Hollywood and in a certain Michael Bay movie that that won't be named because it is absolutely god awful, absolutely terrible. There's a tendency to over glamorize war, to portray it as all macho men, and all glamour and excitement and explosions and all the rest of it. Um, Beaver, he really he portrays the horror and the misery of war. There's a wonderful passage actually I'd love to read from the book to illustrate this point. This is in around the Battle of Oosterbeek, around the battle in and around Arnhem, that area of the fighting. A parachute regiment lieutenant, identifiable only as David, wrote down some impressions while in hiding after the battle. I was obsessed by the reoccurring scenes of the nightmare past, of Mervyn with his arm hanging off, of Pete lying in his grotesque attitude quite unrecognisable, of Angus lying in the dark clinging to the grass in his agony, of the private shouting vainly for a medical orderly. There were none left, of the men running gaily across an opening, the quick crack and his surprised look as he clutched the back of his neck. Oh, his jumps so convulsive as more bullets hit him. How stupid all this war game is. I only hope the sacrifice that was ours in those days will have achieved something. Yet, even at this moment, I feel like it hasn't. It will remain a gesture. Sadly, very, very true words. There was another passage which almost brought me to tears. I'm not ashamed of admitting. In and around the Hotel Hartstein, which was being used as a makeshift hospital in the Battle of Oosterbeek, a young British soldier was invalided into the hospital with a fairly serious wound. But due to overcrowding, and he was actually placed beside a wounded German soldier about his age. But when there was, very intense artillery bombardment from the German sides, both of these young men, they just clutched each other in absolute terror. It's incredibly emotionally telling that that this battle, it really just it nailed home the fact that these were both, young men, and at the end of the day, they were being sent to die for what? For some old general's ego. In the case of the Germans, General Walter Model. For the British, Montgomery, and of course Browning, General Browning. It really hammers home the absolute futility and the absolute waste of life that's war. Just so perfectly. It's tough to read, but it really gets that point across. Also, I like the fact that it doesn't let General Montgomery or Browning off the hook, or General Model, the German commander for that matter. Beaver is very critical of their tactics and their actions during the battle. For instance, with Model, he greatly criticizes the fact that Model didn't blow the Nijmegen road bridge, because apparently Model was planning to counterattack. But my question, of course, is counterattack with what? I mean, this is September 1944. The Eastern Front by this stage is collapsing. The forces of Nazi Germany are completely on the retreat. It just seems like Model was engaged in a lot of wishful thinking there. I would actually recommend reading this book, that you follow the battle and the troop movements with actual maps. That's what I did. I actually had an atlas map of the Netherlands and the battle areas, and I was kind of moving little colored pieces around, to represent the German, the British, and the American forces, which is very, very nerdy of me, but it kind of reminds me of those old wargaming games, those tabletop games. It was really quite fun to do. I sound like a complete nerd doing it, but I don't care. It was incredibly fun just to track the battle in real time as you're reading the book. It's great. But also, if you're unable to do that for whatever reason, I'd also recommend that you watch this history-based YouTuber called Tick. He has a wonderful video series on the Battle of Arnhem, and indeed the whole Operation Market Garden. And he has great tactical maps. He shows the displacement of all the various different units at various different times throughout the battle and the operation. I'll link his video down below in the video description. It's well worth a watch. Interesting fact, actually. When we're while we're wrapping up this video on this book, General Browning's wife was none other than the novelist Daphne du Maurier. She wrote a really good book called Rebecca. It's very good. It captures the emotion of love and insecurity very, very well. It's also a wonderful film starring Laurence Olivier and Joan Fontaine. Interestingly enough, while we're on the topic of Joan Fontaine, I believe it's her birthday today, actually, of the day I'm recording this. Joan Fontaine's uncle was the great Geoffrey de Havilland, who is very famous for de Havilland aircraft. To go back to Empire of the Clouds, de Havilland aircraft, you know, they're quite an important part of the story as well. So yeah, incredibly interesting history. Also, I never knew this before, but the Germans later tried to destroy Nijmegen Bridge with a Mistral aircraft. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that word, but it's German for mistletoe, because mistletoe is a parasitic plant. It essentially consists of a Junkers Ju-88, you know, the famous Schnell bomber, but kind of crudely attached by like this trapeze structure on top is usually a Focke-Wulf FW-190, and the lower part was unmanned. The Focke-Wulf was manned, and what they do is essentially aim it towards a target and detach the Focke-Wulf, and the pilot would attempt to, you know, guide it via radio control, the Junkers, the Ju-88, onto the target, in this case the Nijmegen Bridge, but it failed, thankfully. But it's incredibly funny, because I've always found that that aircraft combination just absolutely wacky. It's like something from a Wile E. Coyote cartoon, just this vast medium bomber and this little fighter just kind of strapped on top of it. It's very comical. Anyway, that about just concludes this video. Thank you very much for watching. I really recommend that you would consider reading these three books, Dr. Zhivago, The Empire of the Clouds, and Arnhem. All are fantastic reads. Yes, they're varied, but you know, I think I really think this, and I genuinely believe this, that, you know, reading a wide variety of material, it heightens your knowledge and understanding and appreciation of life, you know. Even Arnhem, you know, as a young man, it really makes you appreciate life, you know, the fact that, you know, I'm not being sent off to, you know, die at the behest of some arrogant and stupid old general who wants to make a name for himself like Montgomery. I apologize. I've never liked Montgomery, but after reading the book, I really don't have respect for him anymore. To get back to the book, actually, he in one part he said that actually Operation Market Garden was a success, you know, because they got 90% of the way there. You know, they captured most of the bridges bar Arnhem Bridge. But there's a fairly funny quote from the head of the air staff. His name was Air Marshal Arthur Tedder. He kind of said something very funny. He again dryly observed, "One jumps off a cliff with an even higher success rate until the last few inches." It's very, very funny. But yes, thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you again very soon. I have a lot of videos planned on literature and book reviews, that sort of thing, so if you want, please subscribe. Thanks, and I'll see you later.